Nick,
Right.
so for us to start, I would like to cover some of the aspects of your book, the mediated construction of reality. So I would like to ask you, in terms of mediatization and social relations, what outcomes can you point as a consequence of the pandemic, since we are talking about, current issues?
Yeah. Well, let's step back a minute and ask what is mediatization. So mediatization is, as Andreas Hepp and I see it in our book, and following many other writers, it's a long-term process whereby progressively, and this has been happening for centuries, more and more aspects of life become mediated. That is, they are covered in media. We're doing a mediated conversation now. It's being transmitted through media. As more and more aspects of life become mediated, and at the beginning very few were, it was rare to read a newspaper, to receive a letter, and then emails were relatively rare at the beginning. Now we have hundreds a day. As this happens, as more and more aspects of life become mediated, then more feedback loops develop between those different consequences. So we start to expect things to be mediated. We start to develop habits which fit with their being mediated rather than maybe how we would live if we weren't being mediated. And all these deeper effects start to happen and then to reinforce each other until many aspects of our life seem to be dominated by media reference points. And that's what happens when you have mediatization. And then it deepens in late modernity into what Andreas and I call deep mediatization, which is really when you get digitization. So almost everything can enter a media form. There's no picture, no sound, no scribble on a pad that can't be put into media. Everything can be digitized. So everything is potentially media. And then you have platforms which exist to enable us to send everything, which is potentially media. And they're driven by data processes, data extraction, which datafies everything. We'll come back to that later. That takes us to a deeper level. But what you get with deep mediatization is that the basic building blocks, not just the surfaces, but the building blocks of society themselves depend on media. They depend on media infrastructures. They're shaped by the things that media need to work. So you get a different type of social order, a different way of being social together, which now isn't just sometimes reflected in what we do in media, but it's structured by the possibilities of media. That's what we mean by deep mediatization. Obviously, the pandemic occurred in 2020 out of the blue. None of us except the experts in disease were expecting it to come. And suddenly, we all remember it. We suddenly had to reorganize our life based on not being able to physically meet but needing to go on meetings. So we started to become reliant on meeting through platforms, through channels like we're using just now to do the interview. So what did this mean for social relations? Well, I think it's fair to say we don't know fully yet. It's too early to say. This was a really big change. So it's too early to say for sure what it meant. But one thing it definitely meant was an intensification of mediatization. So we all became more dependent on our phones, even more dependent on our phones. We became dependent on platforms like these and Zoom and other basic talk platforms, and meeting platforms, which most of us had not really used before. But I don't know how many meetings I've done now on Zoom, hundreds in the past 2 years. I'm sure you're the same. This has become a basic modality of being social, and we're dependent on it. That's meant also that some of our expectations of basic areas of life, like education, have started to change. And let's be honest, there are some big businesses and the politicians who speak for them who are very keen to take advantage of this crisis. So, for example, when pandemic struck and all the schools in New York had to physically shut down because it was just too dangerous for the kids to be meeting, the ex-mayor of New York Andrew Cuomo. His career has been ended by certain scandals more recently. But the ex-mayor of New York, Andrew Cuomo, said, well, why did we need physical classrooms anyway? Why did we ever have our kids in schools? We had computers for 20 years. Why did we have the internet? Why did we ever need a classroom? So what's going on here is that powerful players are taking advantage of a shift in social pressure, if you like, as Norbert Elias calls it. We need to meet. Suddenly we can't meet physically. We have to meet another way. It creates massive new pressures on all of us. And they're taking advantage of that to say, well, maybe we should reconfigure social life a different way. Now, that's really playing into the fact that mediatization is about the types of social order that we have. Normally, we're not in control of them. They're just happening. They're building out of what we're doing together by just interacting. But politicians claim to want to be able to structure this and to direct it. And we saw some of that with schools taking advantage of platforms, schools saying now, well, all parents need their child to have a smartphone, which makes a big difference if your family is a poor one and you can't afford a smartphone, but you need a smartphone so you can find out what work your kid is meant to be doing. This is a big shift. So deep mediatization drives other social changes, which then reinforce the mediatization even more.
So looking on that side, do you think that the role that the internet today plays is even more harmful than the one TV played back 30, 40 years ago?
Well, it's a good question because it brings out how much things have changed and how the way we think about these things has had to change. I started my career looking at the power of television institutions in shaping and representing reality. They clearly still do. To some degree, TV is shaping the pictures we're getting of Ukraine, let's say, certainly in Europe, I imagine in Brazil as well. But of course, social media alongside it, who may be playing a more important role. But I think at the same time, we're not looking at a sort of even scale here. The internet is not more of the same thing that television was. It's a completely different type of thing. We're now in a space which is completely saturated by media. Everyone carries a phone, which is both a receiver and a transmitter of media. It's unimaginable 20 years ago. Completely unimaginable, but that's a basic fact of today's era. Everyone does that. Even with a small phone that isn't a smartphone, you can at least take pictures and probably send the picture to someone. So this has changed the basic configuration of social space. That raises very complicated questions for the sorts of order we have. On the face of it, it's democratizing. It seems to overturn the undemocratic aspects of media institutions, where before the small elite made the programs and were admired normally, and those of us like you and me, we just watched. Our role was just to watch or to listen or to read. We had almost no chance of ever breaking into the media, and people were angry about that, and it was a deep form of social inequality. That doesn't exactly exist in the same way now, although very few people are Instagram celebrities. So there are forms of inequality, but people have a different sense of how they relate to media. They feel they can send things, certainly to their families and friends and so on. So that's changed, but it's a really difficult question to know whether this is an improvement or not. The rhetoric of politicians, of big business, of media is that this is a freeing up of markets, of democracy. That's the language they use. Whether that's actually the case is much more difficult to work out, because if you imagine where we were before, we had a social space that was large and complex and extremely unequal between countries, within countries, as in Brazil, as in the UK, deeply unequal. But No one had a computer except a few big institutions. Computers were rare things. The only media that was transmitted out from the centers, and we watched it in synchronized ways every night, every morning, and so on and so forth. The flow of media was massively less. The way media flowed was massively less complex. It was not possible for me to send with an image with infinite speed to someone the other side of the planet. And it wasn't possible for me to send it to my friend in the house next door and for them to send it on to the other side of the planet. So I had much more knowledge of what was going to happen to the images and the information and where it was coming from and so on. We now live in a world where we're bombarded with images, some of them almost certainly true, some fake, hard to tell the difference, coming from many different directions, including from many actors who probably are evil. There are evil people in the world in some sense, not a religious sense, but in some sense there are genuinely evil people in the world, and all of them are connected to the internet. All of them are able to send things at the same speed as everyone else and rely on network effects. And then you have platforms which are designed to encourage that. So you've got a very different type of social world and social order. So to sum up, deep mediatization has been intensified, for sure. It's been intensified particularly by the pandemic, but on the back of these other changes. But at the same time, we're really, I think, just at the beginning of understanding what this means for the types of societies we live in, for the types of politics, good and bad, that are possible. It's still possible to be shocked by Bolsonaro and his use of Telegram and so on. Yeah. It's still possible to be shocked by Donald Trump. Maybe in 5 years' time, that will seem naive because we'll have seen this as a norm, and it's a norm of the age we now are condemned to living in because of the way media are structuring. So I think we're in the middle of very great change, and very great change in how we understand that change. We're starting to become alive to the depth of these changes, and that means we have to change our thinking. And it's a time which is really confusing, but also, if you live by analyzing media and theorizing it, quite exciting as well.
Yeah. Do you think media literacy plays an important role there?
Yes, I mean, to some degree. I mean, many people put a lot of emphasis on media literacy. Obviously, it's good to be media literate. The British media regulator, Ofcom, yesterday published a report, which you can find online, because they publish the research every year, asking people, do they trust what they find on the internet? And they found a large number of people do not trust it. Say 25% trust everything they see on the internet, everything. Just as they used to trust everything they saw on TV or everything they read in the newspaper. Most are skeptical. But both those things are troubling. Clearly, it's not wise to trust everything you see on the internet because there are an infinite number of evil actors spreading bad stuff. That's guaranteed. But, also, it's not good to be mainly mistrustful, because too high level of mistrust is bad for society. So I think literacy is important, but it's not enough to deal with this deeper issue about the type of space we're now living in, which arguably is too large, too saturated with potentially bad material, and none of us really know how to regulate that. And literacy is not enough when you're living in a polluted atmosphere. Knowing it smells bad doesn't stop you being damaged. We need to change the environment. So I think literacy is just the start of a small aspect of a much bigger ecological problem in relation.
It's only a small step.
Exactly.
Yeah. Nick, mediated societies haven't contributed for a more equal and free environment so far. And why is that? I ask you that question because I'm 31 today, and I grew up hearing that technologies, especially in communication, had the potential to, create a free environment and equal environment, and it didn't happen. So it's a paradox, isn't it?
It is a paradox, maybe, if you take literally what we were told initially, and these were very powerful discourses, the Nicholas Negroponte of MIT saying, what was it? From prime time, dominated by, TV Global or whatever, to my time. That was clearly, it seemed a very positive thing. And similarly, the idea we all are connected to each other, that you and I can do this conversation, obviously it's positive, exciting. It seems to add up to a freedom. But that was the spin of the media organizations, and it was the belief of very many people. However, that was the belief before we knew that commercial models were going to dominate the internet, which only became clear in the early 1990s with the first commercial browsers and so on. And it was only became really clear when our attention online, which was starting to become uncontrollable, there was just too much there, started to be channeled through the things we now call platforms, which were themselves private businesses, not state-run, dominated by getting our attention to maximize advertising income. That was the business model which became dominant very quickly. It needn't have been, but it was the business model. It could have been a subscription model, but we very quickly moved to the idea of free service for the price of advertising, having access to you, which meant data collection became the norm, which meant many other things about the whole ecology of the way platforms work changed radically. Basically, it became about optimizing attention. Now, this is the core reason why I think there is less freedom and less equality. But we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that there's still a basic truth that media are essential. Certain media are essential for freedom. So the economist and philosopher Amartya Sen from India and the US made a fundamental point that famines happen in societies without democratic media, societies where governments literally can hide the fact there is no food in part of the country. You can't do that where there's media. Social media intensified that, but it was already true where you had adequate television and newspapers. You can't have a famine in those countries, or it's very difficult because the news is so urgent that it will spread and the government will be in trouble and they will be forced to do something about it. So that remains true. But where we made the mistake 30 years ago was to believe that the internet is just a continuation along the same line or spectrum as television and media. But it's a radically different type of thing. It's a space rather than a broadcast medium. It's a space of circulation. And we made the choice to make that space of circulation dominated by commercial models, incentivized to get attention wherever they could get it, on whatever terms they could get it, rather than a controlled mass media environment where certain public values, including, let's say, TV Global criticized a lot, of course, in Brazil, but still operating within certain norms and values, was in a focused way circulating from a center. So that was a radically different space from the media space we now exist in. And that's why there's this difference in relation to freedom, I believe, fundamentally.
Yeah, it's amazing because it seems like they found the perfect gap where they could make a lot of money from advertising and, of course, extracting data. And, we are still, as you said, learning how to deal with it and even how to, to understand what this means. And I think this is the perfect link where we can move on to your other book, The Costs of Connection, where you and Ulisses Mejias explore the concept of data colonialism. How do you relate, to start, historical colonialism to data colonialism?
Well, it's a big topic, but just briefly, I mean, historical colonialism isn't completely finished, of course. There are still colonies, and Britain and America still have them. And also the neo-colonial effects of colonialism obviously live on. They affect the racial politics of a country like Brazil or the United States or Britain. They affect the economic dependency of many African economies on other bigger societies, of other societies, and so on the north. So all that is true. What Ulysses and I were trying to do was to get a sense of how deep and how broad the changes are with data. Everyone agrees that data is now important. We agree with a lot of what Shoshana Zuboff says in her book on surveillance capitalism, that there are now dedicated businesses designed to make value and profit out of extracting data from the flow of human life. And we'll come back to the consequences of that a bit later. So we agree with that. The question is whether one can understand that completely, sufficiently within the framework of capitalism. Capitalism is clearly part of what's going on. It's part of capitalism. The question that we have to step back to is that, of course, capitalism only emerged out of colonialism. It was only possible to have this intensely organized configuration of the economy and society based around the exclusive pursuit of profit if you already had a lot of resources. And where did those resources came from? They came from the pillaging of the colonies, particularly initially by Spain and Portugal, and then, of course, Britain, England, and Holland. So it was colonialism that made capitalism possible 250 years later. And underlying all the ideas of management within capitalism and the idea of totally dominating the world's resources was the underlying idea that the Peruvian sociologist Quijano calls coloniality, the idea that the West has a privileged relation to rationality, that it knows best for the rest of the world. And it's because of that that it's entitled to take the rest of the world's resources. Absurd when you put it in such simple language. And yet this literally was the justification, the rationale, sometimes with an additional religious justification as well, that made sense of and allowed colonizers to think they were doing something good and that they were right to use force, to grab the gold, to grab the silver, and so on, and to employ slaves to harvest the land. So that's the history of colonialism, which is not completely over. And we tend, looking back over 500 years, and it's important that the two of us were developing these ideas. I'm white. I come from the UK, one of the colonizing powers. Ulysses comes from Mexico, so he has a different lived experience of colonialism from me. But we developed the ideas together. But our normal starting point, looking back over 500 years, is to say, well, what's important about colonialism is the racism, the institutions of racism, and it's the desperate physical violence. And of course, these were the lived experience. But we want to add a slightly different perspective, which we think gives us a chance to see if there's a new type, a new version of colonialism which is emerging today. And this is to say that at the root of historical colonialism was something in a way very simple. It was the idea of a land grab, taking everything, taking the world just to benefit one small part of the world, and doing that on the basis that you had somehow a higher right to it because you were more intelligent, you were smarter, you had the better guns and so on, and better technologies and so on and so forth. This was the core of colonialism, and it was this idea of coloniality that Quijano talks about. And what we want to suggest is that what's going on with data today at its core is something similar to those two things. It's a new land grab, this time not taking the land. There's no more land to take. It's not taking what's in the land. We're increasingly having to stop mining the oil and so on for various reasons. And it's not the bodies, because slavery, thank God, is over largely, although there are new forms of it developing for other reasons. What it means is taking a new territory, which is human life. The whole space of our experience, our encounters with the world, the way we interact with our friends and family and loved ones and workmates and whatever. Just taking all of that and saying that can be there for capital as well to exploit, to extract value from it. Of course, through a new means, which is the new means of data. So you've got a new domain, a new means, which is data extraction, leading to the same basic move to take everything and to take it apparently with the justification of some superior rationality. The new rationality this time is the idea that we need as much data as we can get to make business run, to make business efficient, to increase global profitability, and so on. So our argument is that within the development of capitalism that's obviously operating through data, there's this deeper continuity, which is with the very start of colonialism. And we're arguing we're at the start of a new age of colonialism, which is in most ways continuous with the old one, except it's got this new domain and its new technique, which is data. And this is not just the continuation of capitalism. It's a new phase, just as the original colonialism was a completely new stage in human history, because human beings had not imagined they could take everything before and do it by force, on the basis of no social relations, no war, just go in and grab the lot. It's a shocking analogy, but we believe it's an accurate one, that we think that is what is going on with corporations and the taking of data from human life today.
Yeah. But unlike the Portuguese or the British, who used force against native populations, the big tech companies, they don't need to impose their interests through physical violence, right? And does it have anything to do with this new phase of capitalism?
Yeah, well, this is a key question, because for many people it seems shocking, even, silly, playful, to say what's going on today is a new stage of colonialism. Because where is the brutal violence, which was really mind-blowing? Anyone who's read Bartolomé de las Casas' history of the destruction of the Indies, it's profoundly shocking, the level of violence. But we argue that although violence has to be remembered, and it must never be forgotten, that doesn't mean to say that if we think about what colonialism fundamentally was, that violence was the most important thing. The most important thing, we argue, was the land grab. That was the thing with the most lasting historical consequences. We're still living its consequences today across the world. And the way that was justified. And there was a good reason why violence was necessary then and it's not necessary now. And the reason was that the colonizers were going out from Europe and they thought they were going to find Asia. They didn't know what the land existed that they ended up finding. They didn't even know it existed. So they had zero relations with those people. They didn't have even the beginnings of social relations with them. So there were only two things they could use to take what they wanted, which was the gold and silver and so on, which was brutal physical violence, terror, and of course lying, pretending they were giving gifts, accepting the gifts of the indigenous peoples, which they happily did before killing them. So there were no alternatives at that point. But of course now, this new phase of colonialism, if we're right to call it that, is emerging on the back of not only 500 years of colonialism, which is still there in the background, having a strong power, as we argue, but of course 250 years of capitalism. And in the 250 years of capitalism, we have been trained to learn how to conform to the capitalist economy. We sign contracts. We go to work on time. We appear with our friends on time. We have learned how to conform to a capitalist society in a way that took decades to inculcate in people. And that means that an awful lot can be achieved just by your phone, the people who operate your phone, sending, will you accept the new terms and conditions of the software? Will you accept the software update? will you accept that it's going to do something slightly different with your data? Click accept. There's no violence necessary. Clicking accept has already changed your relations to the data gathered on your phones. It's already changed your relations to your own life, and there's no violence needed, which is not to say that the data economy sometimes doesn't impose terrible violence on those with no work, those dependent on social welfare and other things. That is absolutely true. But at this basic level, violence is no longer necessary to achieve what you might call force. Forcible, directed, non-negotiable change in your behavior.
Nick, I would like to ask you now, why data matters, and how does the appropriation of data become appropriation of human life itself?
Yeah. Well, at the basic level, data matters because data is a systematic way of categorizing the world. I mean, language is based on categories, apples versus pears, and so on. Language is built from categories. Data is a way of systematically building categories in architectures, in relationships, and doing it in an ordered way so that you can build systems of classification. And every society has a system of classification, in fact, as anthropologists have said for 2 centuries. So categorizations always do matter because they're the basic elements in terms of which we think and speak and organize the world. But data, of course, takes this to a massively larger scale. 30 years ago, there were some big categories you need to worry about. Which citizenship did you have? What was your date of birth? Were you married or not married? And so on. But there were only a finite set of categories that probably really mattered, and you could maybe master them and make sure they were not misrepresented. Now, each of us, we know that big data brokers holds at least 1,500 data points about each of us. And they interact in ways generating new data points that we literally have no idea about. So we actually don't know very much of how we're being categorized anymore. And yet, at the same time, that data is being more actively put to use the whole time. There's a lot of money involved, and that's because it can be put to use to give us better offers. Well, that's nice. Or to decide that we definitely won't get a loan because of certain behavior, way we drive our car, maybe certain events in our family. Well, that's not so nice. So data is extremely important in basically the ordering of how resources get distributed in society. In other words, the decisions that get made in regulating society, and they're increasingly driven by data. So data definitely matters. And there are many areas like personal finance, social welfare, education, health, and even the basic workplace, where they're now regulated increasingly by data. In other words, unless you're in a very high status job in a corporation, almost certainly you are a generator of data. Data is extracted from your performance to evaluate it, to measure it, to decide how much you're paid, and maybe just to sack you without warning on the basis of some prediction that you're a poor performer. This is becoming normal in the workplace today, and not just for the people who work on digital platforms. So at the most basic level, data really matters to the basic ordering of social life. So, but as you ask a good question, how does that go on to grab human life itself? Well, there are sort of 2 levels to that. First of all, it's because the data comes from human life, and increasingly there are very few aspects of human life that data is not gathered from. There's some areas where we probably say no. We would not accept an app that tries to test, do we feel in love with someone, or are we really feeling grief today after the death of a loved one? That might be unacceptable. But there are very few areas that are now not leading to datafication through apps. So almost every part of the domain of human life is being datafied, it's being turned into data. So that's one basic sense in which grabbing data means grabbing access to human life. But There's another level, which is that there's an increasing attempt by marketers, governments, and so on to use that data to influence us. This is what one legal theorist called Karen Jung calls the hyper nudge. We're all familiar with the idea of a nudge, where we're just encouraged to do what we'd like to do anyway. Maybe eat less chocolate, and, it's good for our body, we feel happier. And a little nudge, fine. But a hyper nudge is where you live in a space where you're being nudged the whole time. You're like a ball in a pinball machine. There's no decision you think you make which hasn't already been influenced in the background by some message you've just been sent, some special offer you've just received, and so on and so forth. The hypernudge starts to raise questions about whether we really do have free choices in the economy where we are meant to be free, because it's a market economy. So that's a second level where grabbing data potentially grabs control over the choices people make. And then there's a third, even more basic level, which is that data can't be gathered unless we're being tracked. There's no way I can gather data about your facial expression and whether it reveals something about your personality, which is very much what marketers believe they can do, unless I'm tracking you pretty regularly and building up a large database, which enables me to interpret what your expressions mean and what they signify in terms of your underlying emotional state, heart rate, so on and so forth. But this agreement to tracking, Ulysses and I believe, is itself a fundamental challenge to human liberty. As I was saying to their students just yesterday, if you describe what goes on in today's typical classroom, where there's an ed tech platform and the kids do their homework on a platform supplied by Microsoft or Google or Apple, you would say, well, this is surveillance. It's total surveillance. It's a panopticon. That was our normal political language for what's going on. But that's not the language which the ed tech people call it. They call it personalized training. They say it's not surveillance. So there's a strange doublethink here, that what we know is surveillance, we're told is not surveillance, and we increasingly argue is an intensification of our freedom. But actually, it is tracking. It is literally the taking of life, so that what we know is bad in the political world, having the state looking over your shoulder all the time, so you're afraid to do anything anymore. Your action is chilled because the risks are too high of doing anything. So you just stay at home. You don't speak to anyone. You just keep quiet, hope nothing happens. This chilling effect, there's a risk that this is spreading into the social world, and yet it's described as something else. Personalized, customized tracking. So there are at least three levels in which I think taking data really does have fundamental implications for human life and the very basis of freedom.
So, as we witness the continuous increase of data usage for a broad range of devices, why do you believe the development of the Internet of Things is a bad idea?
Yeah. Well, the Internet of Things is interesting because whereas many things we've been describing are not linear developments of what happened before, we're living in an era where there's been really radical, sudden change to a new state of being, a new type of connected space, very different from the mass media era. On the other hand, the Internet of Things is a continuation of what we had before in the earlier Internet era. And the reason is that it means that instead of the connecting up of space, the intensification of data flows being linked only to the devices which we as human beings choose to open, to switch on, to send a message through. Now, that capacity of sending and receiving data is built into more and more things that we think are our tools. The smart fridge, the smart lighting system, the smart doorbell. I don't know how far these are spreading in Brazil, but I'm sure they're spreading amongst at least the elites in Sao Paulo and Rio for sure, even if they're not spreading in much in the wider population. For sure the elites have these things. Now, this means this intensifies the idea of the flow of data. It means that there literally is almost no point in space that isn't generating data. Why is this a bad thing? First of all, there's a deeply practical reason that the devices that are doing this generation of data tend to be very crude computers. They're not like the laptop you're looking through now, the desktop that I'm using, which have very high memory capacities, which mean they're able to take very complex updates overnight from Microsoft, let's say, or they already have very sophisticated security systems like an Apple device, which mean that they're robust, they're protected against hacking. Mm-hmm. These small computers in your fridge or your doorbell are very crude computers, so they can't be updated overnight. They don't actually have the security capacity to protect themselves from being hacked. And very often people forget to change their passwords from the factory set password anyway. So they are very vulnerable devices. And that's not me saying that. That's one of the best experts in the world on internet security, Bruce Schneier, based at Harvard. These are very dangerous devices, number one. And number two, they're all connected to each other, which means you have a massive spread of insecurity right across the space. You multiply it by many, many higher powers. This is why we have firestorms of internet security breaks and so on. So it's a basic practical reason to think the Internet of Things is probably a bad thing. In other words, if we say a device is smart, that means installing it probably is not smart. The second thing is this very idea of being more connected is a better way of living. I think we need to challenge that in itself, because what it basically installs is the idea that more seamless data connection is automatically good. Well, we know it's good for corporations that want to optimize data. It's got to be good for them because that's what they define themselves now in terms of doing. Is it good for human beings? Well, there are things we might want more data on. We want data to protect women in public places. We want data to enable women to feel safe living in their own home against male violence. There may well be areas where we think more data is necessary. Let's take that point seriously. But does that mean we go from that to say we want all of our life to be tracked, all of our life to be dependent on an app and a device that's recording our heart rate, our memory capacity, number of steps we've taken, our every conversation we have with our kids about are we talking in the right tone? You may remember that Amazon Halo Amazon 2 years ago introduced something called Amazon Halo, which was going to be something in the home that was going to intensify a bit the idea of Amazon Alexa, the digital personal assistant. Halo was an idea that it would be literally tracking your heart rate and all your body variables, and even better, tracking your tone of voice when you spoke to people in your family, and picking up if maybe you'd had a bad day. Maybe you were getting a bit aggressive with your partner as a result. Maybe you shouldn't do that. Well, it's pretty obvious that this started to step over a line. Yes, in theory, we want to speak well to our partners. We don't want to get angry at the end of a bad day. But human life is based on such imperfections. Do we really want to delegate to an external organization not only the ability to track us as we do that, but also the ability to store the data about what they've tracked? I think we don't. So we have to watch very careful what door we're opening here. And this door is this bigger space of datafying everything. And that is literally the mission of the Internet of Things.
Nick, I know we are reaching the limit of
Sure.
our interview, but there are two more things I must ask you,
Sure.
and I'll try to synthesize both together.
Okay, fine.
How does this new stage of capitalism affect democracies across the globe and other countries that are still struggling with authoritarian regimes? And is it possible to decolonize data through state regulations?
Well, let me start with the second question, because although it's not possible to fully answer it, it's easier to say why. Because Ulysses and I, we're skeptical about whether state regulation is sufficient to deal with these deep problems. And the reason basically is what we've been talking about for the past hour is the building of a new type of social and economic order, which has implications for political order too. And you can't just fix that by passing a law. because this is about how all of us behave to each other. It's the assumptions we have, the way we think about the world we live in. You can't change that by passing a law. That's not to say that we don't need regulations to stop certain data being gathered, to stop organizations sharing data with other organizations without people's consent. And maybe I believe this strongly to regulate social media platforms to change their business models. I'll come back to that in a moment. So state regulations have a really important role. And let's put it another way. A government like you have currently in Brazil, which absolutely refuses to regulate in certain key areas, can do an awful lot of damage. Mm-hmm. So the state does play an important role. But it cannot be enough. To change the social order, all of us need to behave differently. We need to imagine a different world where we do behave differently and start to work towards it through solidarity, through helping each other live a different type of life, just as we do in relation to the even greater challenge of climate change. You will not change climate change by passing a law making certain things illegal. Yes, it will help. Yes, it may be absolutely necessary, but it cannot be enough. All of us have to change our lives in relation to this for the result on the scale that we know needs to happen, which is a different type of order. Now, you raise a very difficult question about whether this new stage of surveillance capitalism or data colonialism, as Ulysses and I prefer to call it, what is its effect on democracies across the world? And how does it affect those which aren't democracies, authoritarian regimes? I mean, this, again, I can't answer because it's so complex, but I think it's complex for a different reason. It's because this is really still unfolding. We're still, as I said to you earlier, we're still at the stage where we're shocked at certain things happening. So to give you an example, when the Christchurch terrible massacre happened in Christchurch, New Zealand in March 2018, a monster shooting people in a mosque and filming it at the same time and immediately broadcasting that through Facebook, the GoPro footage, unimaginably horrific. And not just because of the violence. And yet this was a possibility of Facebook as a platform that it marketed as a plus. And we'd allowed this to develop. We're still shocked, which is good. But it's a sign that we are still catching up with the potentialities of this order we're living in, of instant connection, infinite speed of transmission, anyone a sender. This is a radically different world. So is it positive for democracy or negative? Well, there are clearly some positive aspects. It's good a lot of the time that people can be mobilized for political change faster than they could. This could be very important in the upcoming elections that you have in federal elections that you're going to have in Brazil, where I hope for a certain outcome. I don't need to say any further. But it could be very important. Mobilization is important. On the other hand, mobilization is only the beginning of politics. You can mobilize people, but if you don't offer actual change and if you don't think and plan carefully what change means and then actually implement it, then you end up disappointing people more than they originally thought they could be disappointed. And there are strong arguments for believing that our hyper-connected world is not one where it's easy to plan complex political change, because there is always negative criticism, whatever you do. There's always insults, there's always abuse. It's very hard to build new political parties under these circumstances, which are actually stable. So there are many arguments for thinking that our political world has become more full of democratic excitement and mobilization, but it's become less stable, and it's become actually harder to build permanent, real change. Partly also because we're spending less time physically together, working together, building movements together in the way that movements were built until 2000. And or even maybe we'd say 2010. We're spending much less time doing that, and we're spending more time on our phones just sending stuff at each other, which is not how you build solidarity. I need to see you. I need to spend time with you. I need to hear you cry. I need to know what causes you pain, to know whether we really share something. That's the basis of what solidarity is. And that is not necessarily encouraged by the internet. And this is a tragedy of our era. And it's something of which my next book is going to be about. That on the one hand, we all want to believe that this connected world is a better one, because connection is a good thing. It's exciting, it's thrilling, it's introduced thrilling aspects of the contemporary world, for sure. But what if the costs of connection are even higher than that excitement? What if it's introducing an instability we don't anymore know how to live with? What if it's spreading violence in a way that there is no government that control, like the terrible WhatsApp-driven violence in India, with people being strung up and killed on the basis of pure rumor? Of course, that happened in previous societies. But it's happening at a speed now, with less reason, and on a scale that didn't necessarily happen in previous societies. So these, I think, are the questions we have to ask. We can't turn back. We can't suddenly become unconnected. And we can't give up on the project of democracy, that's for sure, because I believe, I know some people disagree, but I believe we will never solve climate change and the fundamental problems of gender violence and the other things which are the crises of our age without more democracy. I don't believe that's possible. I know some people believe we need authoritarian government, but I don't think we will act together unless we believe in the rationality of acting together and why we're fighting together to change things. So we need more democracy. But I think it remains an open question whether the type of connection we have right now that is based around platforms that are driven by business models, which are motivated by profit, based on data extraction and engagement, so-called engagement, is the right basis for building the type of connection we need for a better world. I think that's really uncertain at the moment. Maybe we need to go back to basics and think about redesigning the platforms which allow us to connect. That's what I think, sadly, we have to think about, which is not turning back. It's turning into the future, but in a more sober way, understanding the sad lessons we've learned from the past 15 years of connection, as well as, of course, the many good lessons.